Hey everybody, I'm Amzie Winning. Today on Undressing Bourbon, we are here at Lawrenceburg Bourbon Company to talk to Greg Keeley. Come on in. Well, Greg, thank you for joining us today. We're looking forward to learning a little bit about you and Lawrenceburg Bourbon Company. So I guess, first of all, just tell us, how did you end up where you are today?
Amzie, that's a terrific question. So I spent 22 years thereabouts in the US Navy, and prior to that in the Australian Navy. In what I did, there's not a lot of transferable skills. I couldn't go and become a mechanic or anything else. So when I retired out of the USN a few years ago, or was medically retired out of the USN a few years ago, I went and did a few different things. I worked for a private equity firm. I did a couple of tech startups. And then happenstance just brought us to, my wife Katie and I, to Kentucky. And we didn't know a single person here. We didn't know really anything about it. I certainly didn't know where Lawrenceburg was. But we just really loved Kentucky. And so what happened is Katie left her career as a US diplomat when she was at the UN and all over the world, because she wanted to be a nurse for American veterans. So at the ripe old age of, I'm not going to say because it might get back to her, Katie went to nursing school in Birmingham, Alabama at UAB, and I took a contract down here in Lexington, and I just fell in love with Kentucky. Long story short, we decided to move to Kentucky, and as I say quite often, it was not so much that I found the bourbon industry or distilling, but it's, it kind of found me in some respects. I've been playing around with distilling for nearly a decade, off and on, while I was in the military and then when I got out. And the other thing I'll often joke about, Amzie, is that, when you move to Kentucky, there's only two things you can do. It's either horses or bourbon. And I'm scared shitless of horses. And I kind of enjoy bourbon. So It was an easy transition.
Mm-hmm. Is there sort of that first bourbon experience, the first time you had bourbon? Is there a time when you sort of fell in love with bourbon that you can share with us?
It's funny you ask that. Yes, and this will sound a little cliched, but I was working in Washington, D.C. I was an advisor to a US senator, and a couple of friends and I had, we'd played around bourbon, but it was all whiskey. But it was Jack Daniels and it was Jim Beam. It was just the standard stuff you have at college kind of deal. And it was great. But one day, one of my friends, Mike, brought over, and we were sitting out the front in downtown DC on Capitol Hill at our house. And he brought over this thing called Buffalo Trace. Never heard of it before. It was a little 750. And he's like, do you want to try this? I just got it, at the local liquor store. Never heard of it. No one had really heard of it at this point. So we drink this thing called Buffalo Trace, right? And I'm like, this is fabulous. It's so good. And we were raving about it to the point, this is no word of a lie, I wrote an actual letter to Buffalo Trace, because you couldn't get it, saying, we would like to buy some more Buffalo Trace here in Washington, D.C. What do we do? They never wrote back, of course. But that was probably the seminal, I really want to learn more about this, and there's a lot more to it than the mass market stuff that I grew up at in college or soon after. So that was the moment, and it was Buffalo Trace that got me onto the bandwagon. So I haven't thought about that story for 10 years.
So another question here, we probably haven't asked too many other people, if anyone, on this yet. So your accent obviously is a little south of Kentucky.
Right, yeah, Alabama.
So in Australia, is bourbon very popular there?
No, it's. I get asked that question here a lot. Australia is the culture in Australia is a drinking culture, always has been, but it's a beer and wine culture. So people will sit down at lunch on a Monday at a work lunch and have a couple of beers and a bottle of wine. Spirits never come into the equation, and I like to. How I explain this to folks is, you know, if you go into a liquor barn here in Lexington, and you walk into the main one there, and it's got two rows of bourbon. You do that in the equivalent kind of store in Perth or in Melbourne or in Sydney, it's gin. But the rest of the store is just wine. So you can buy Jim Beam, etc., in Australia. There's a little bit more creeping in. There's a couple of great little distilleries in Australia now, mainly focusing on rum and gin, but they're fantastic. But you're starting to see some other, like a Woodford or the big players are down there. But the thing with Australia is, because it's from a spirits perspective, it's primarily a gin culture. All the liquor is 80 proof or thereabouts. So, you might be buying a wild turkey, I'm not going to say 101, but it's proof down to 80. Everything is 80 because that's just, and it's in a 700ml bottle. So, when I take over, I took some over to my dad a couple of months back, and my mom's looking at the proof and she's like, what does the 124 mean? And I said, well, that means it's like a third stronger than the Jack Daniels Dad's got covered. She's like, yeah, well, we're not having that. But suffice to say, we snuck a couple of drams over the course of a month.
So when you think of bourbon, is there a place that comes to mind?
Only insofar as Capitol Hill was where I first started trying bourbons and buying things that every Friday after work or Thursday, whatever I'd do it, I would go to, there was a great liquor store on Capitol Hill on the Senate side, can't think of what it's called, but I'd go in there once a week and spend up to $50 on a bottle. And my other friends would do the same, and we'd go and do little bottle shares and stuff. And so I built this little collection of sub $50 whiskey, and some of it was fantastic. So I'll always remember that because we invariably went to my house because it was closest to the Capitol. And we'd sit around, have some bourbons, and after you do that for 3 or 4 months, you've got a pretty good collection in the cupboard. And eventually that went onto the shelf, and that was when I had a bourbon collection, which I don't anymore. But I'll remember that because it was really when I was first trying. I had some whiskey that was just awful, but I also had some whiskey that was just extraordinary. And literally everything I drank was new. I'd never had it before. So, that's to me was part of that whole immersing myself in what it looked like. And it's like I started listening to country music when I joined the US military, right? I was 35 or something, 34. And so I'd listen to all these like George Strait songs and things like that. Like, this guy's fantastic. Where did he come from? And they're like, this song was big in the 70s. I'm like, well, to me, it was brand new. It's new right now. And that's what this bourbon was to me. It was new the time I drank it. And I remember some of those now, but George Strait and, some good old Russells, 10-year-old or whatever. And back when you could buy something like that for $30. It was, but you think this is a 15, 20 years ago. It's probably 20 years ago. You could buy some of this extraordinary bourbon, 15 years ago, but you could buy some extraordinary bourbon for like pennies on the dollar now. And you think back to that and it's like, geez, I wish I'd bought a case of that at the time. I'd be retiring.
Yeah, and you think back to the times when you could easily find all those bottles and they were cheap, and the Pappy Van Winkles would sit on the shelf for months and collect dust, because people didn't want to pay $200 for a bottle of whiskey. But
right.
Then the growth and the expansion and the boom that is bourbon right now, has of course afforded so many other other things. So we kind of have to be grateful for that as well.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think what we're seeing now, or what I'm seeing at least, is that there's a lot of craft distillers popping up, and not just NDPs, but also folks that are making some really great spirits from scratch, and it's hard. But we get a lot of visitors through here now in our new facility, which has only been open a couple of months, and they'll say, "Oh yeah, we've done the two of the big legacy corporate kind of tours, and we know about 51% corn and dipping our finger in the thing and all that," and that's great, and they love it, and they've learned a whole lot about it. But then I think people have become more discerning or educated about the bourbon and the process and where it comes from. So what we're finding, at least here, is people are doing the two big legacy distillery tours and doing their thing, and then they're coming to us. They're coming to Castle and Key. They're going to the smaller distilleries around here, and there's some great small distilleries, and I think that augurs well. I think we'll see a time where the market or the industry contracts a little bit. I don't think it can sit where it is, ad nauseum. But I think while you have these small distilleries making some really good whiskey, really good bourbon, it's great for the consumer. I think it's terrific for Kentucky. Just like Bourbon on the Banks brings people in from all over the place. The trail does that every day, and most of the folks we get in here are from out of state. And the first question, can we get this in? Well, no, but they'll go back and they'll talk about it, and more people will come, and and we get told all the time, "Oh, we've never heard of you guys, but we're just going down to Wild Turkey, which is 3,000 feet down the road." And so they stop in and they have a great time. We've got some really wonderful folks at work here, and we try and offer an experience as opposed to we're never going to match a tour with Four Roses or Buffalo Trace or anything. Obviously, we don't want to do that. So we try and do experiences. So that means doing a masterclass cocktails with Emily at the bar, doing whiskey thieving out of finished barrels in our thieving room, doing single barrel select. So you've got 4 single barrels just sitting next to each other, so you can learn what the difference is. And that's what we're trying to do. And if people want to go and look at our still and our barrels, they can sit on the porch and have a cocktail and look straight in. But that's what we're trying to do is make it experience based, as opposed to people don't need us to tell them that it's got 51% corn. So and if they want to know, we'll tell them. So that's sort of where we're going, and I think it's good for the industry. I think it's great for the small distillers. The KDA do a great job. Kentucky Distillers Association do a great job, sort of helping both the big guys and the little guys. And while I do think you'll see some contraction in the next couple of years, and I think you're seeing it, when you go outside of Kentucky, it's harder for a small distiller or any distiller, particularly if they're making whiskey, because they don't have the trail baked in. And so I think you're already seeing some die off there, which is sad. But I think you'll probably see a little bit of that here, but not on the same level.
Well, and you talked about not maybe matching the tour experience that you would have at a Wild Turkey or Four Roses or a Buffalo Trace or somewhere. But I think that's actually the good thing. I hope people who haven't had a chance to visit craft distilleries will do that. When they're in the area, you're going to the big distillery, see what else is around. The big distilleries, they not only are pumping out the cases of alcohol, they've got to pump the tourists through. And it becomes this larger sort of sterilized experience. But when you go to those places, you get the history and you see that, and that's an amazing thing. But when you come to a craft distillery, the experience you get is so much more intimate.
Right.
You're talking to the people who are making the whiskey. You have people that this is their life. This is their livelihood. This is their passion.
Right.
And I think you're usually going to see that passion. And so those people are going to strive to make a good product. That's what you want.
Well, you literally live and die by your last barrel.
Yeah.
You know, and that sounds dramatic, but it's kind of not. Like if we were to put into, say, Liquor Barn, a barrel pick or something, and it was not well received, they wouldn't take another one. And you can't afford to do that. So whenever we put out, I think we were talking sort of off camera, that if we put out a single barrel, it has to be a single barrel. Like it has to be good enough. I can't just put it out because we've got a barrel sitting there. And we'll find other uses for the stuff that doesn't quite make it. But, you know, if you're a bigger distillery, you can probably get away with that. We can't. If we put out a dud barrel, it's going to reflect very badly on us for a long time. So, and, you know, if you did it 2 or 3 times in a row, you probably couldn't get back from it. And that's, you know, that's not just us, it's any small distillery, whether they're, you know, making gin, rum, bourbon, whatever it might be. I think that's very true what you said.
So earlier, you know, I asked about, you know, a location that comes to mind when you think about bourbon. You know, and I want to say bourbon or whiskey, either way. Is there a person that comes to mind when you think about bourbon or whiskey?
Well, yes, and this will sound a little bit trite, but my wife, Katie, so this is a story I have to tell you. So she's a Navy reservist now, and she was away for like 6 or 8 weeks doing Navy stuff. And it was in that 6 or 8 weeks I finally pulled the trigger on doing the Lawrenceburg Bourbon Company, to the point where I got a T-shirt printed. And I filed all my paperwork, got everything done, we got all our barrels sorted, and we were all ready to go. So Katie walks in the door. It was dark outside. She comes in, she's in her dress whites. I hadn't seen her in whites for a long time. And she was all pleased as punch, the dogs were all jumping around. And I'm like a goose, standing there with this orange T-shirt that says Lawrenceburg Bourbon Company. And she's like, oh, that, she's putting down her bags. And she's like, oh, that's nice. What's that? And I said, it's our bourbon company. It's our distillery. And she's like, what the? I'm like, oh, we'll talk about it over a cocktail. And she's like, oh, yeah, we will. And so that'll be, Katie tells that story much better than me, but it's 100% true. As I said earlier, you know, in the Navy, we do things and then ask for forgiveness. That was where I really played that card, you know, pretty hard. But as Katie says, the whiskey's good, so we're not divorced yet. So that was, like that's, you know, Katie and whiskey, because of that, will always be a thing for me. And, you know, insofar as, you know, longevity or things that go back further, I was never really you know, when I was growing up, it wasn't even on my radar until I was in my late 20s, early 30s living here. So, or early 30s probably. So I'm a bit of a late bloomer insofar as that goes. But yeah, that was on the bourbon journey. That's certainly I'd have to put Katie on the on the list for that one.
Looking back, would you have given her the cocktail first?
In hindsight, yeah. Yeah. I would have maybe run her a bath.
Yeah.
Not just stood there with a T-shirt like a smiling moron.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was pretty funny. She literally tells that to every person that comes in the distillery.
So today, I picked up a T-shirt in the gift shop that kind of jumped out at me. On the logo, the Born to Fight logo you got there. Is there a story behind that? There
is. So the Born to Fight is a mantra of the Royal Australian Navy. It dates back to the First World War. You know, with there was a German pocket battleship or cruiser, whatever you want to call it, that was in the Pacific and around the Australian islands and Indonesia, called the Emden, and Australia, a light or a cruiser, sank that ship, and her battle cry or whatever was Born to Fight. So that's found its way into the lexicon of Australian culture insofar as tattoos and things like that. So a lot of the imagery that you see here and on the T-shirt you've got, and even on our bottles, is that Born to Fight, and it's the boxing kangaroo, and in the original, that guy has a German, like, the pointy helmet, like you see in the movies.
Yeah.
Had that on and everything. He was clenched, and we thought that was a little politically incorrect. So we changed it up a bit.
Yeah.
And on the circle, you can see the yellow flowers on the bottom. They're the Australian wattle, and they're the national flower of Australia. So we added that, and they grow wild on our property at home. And but you'll see a lot more. We've got a lot of imagery that we're using that are old sort of Australian World War I tattoos, and we're really leaning into that. Most of a lot of our small team are veterans or family. Immediate family of veterans here or serving folks. So that's really important to us. And the Born to Fight thing, I just love, and it's our thing. And people are like, you can't say that with a bourbon company. I'm like, well, why not? Because that's what we're all about. And, everyone said we couldn't do it. And, touch wood, we've got this far. We haven't closed the doors yet after a couple of years. So, we're just going to keep on, as it were.
Yeah, I would imagine, starting something like this from the ground up, you definitely have to fight. So
my wife Katie always says, when folks are on the trail, Buffalo Trace isn't going to notice if you don't buy a bottle from them, but we sure as hell will notice if you do buy a bottle from us. And I think that rings true for every craft distiller or small distillery in the Commonwealth. That, Buffalo Trace, Wild Turkey, and Cert, big distillery here, won't know or care if you don't buy one. But every time you buy a bottle from a small Kentucky distillery, they will literally notice, and it makes a big difference.
Yeah. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Undressing Bourbon, bringing it home. I really do appreciate the time and getting to know you a little bit better. Cheers.
Cheers, old boy.
And to all of you watching, thank you for joining us on behalf of all of us here at Bourbon on the Banks Festival. We hope you had a good time. Hope you learned a few things about Greg and Lawrenceburg Bourbon Company. Cheers, everyone.